Our next speakers are a duo of influential advocates for educational justice and high achievement in all of California for all of California students. They work in tandem with lawmakers, staff, and the public to influence policy in a way that produces truly better outcomes for students in need of advocacy. Natalie Wheatfall Lum is the Director of P16 Education Policy at the Education Trust West. Clara Medina Maya is an External Relations Associate at the Education Trust West. Clara and Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Zaid. We're so happy to be here, and I really appreciate the warm welcome from Ed100. And to get us started, what we do at EdTrust West is we center the experiences that we've had as students in our lives that inform the work that we do in education equity. So I'm going to start by introducing myself and talk a little bit about my own background and how it informs the work that we do. So I am a California native. I grew up in Southern California in San Diego. And as an 8th grader, I transferred from a school district that had a high number of students of color and working class low income students to a very affluent, predominantly white school district. And in that experience, I noticed two things. I first noticed that there's a significant difference in the type of resources that I saw between those two schools. My old school had dated books, broken down furniture, dated buildings, and at the new school I was at had brand new books. Everything was state of the art, and I could see there was a definite difference in resources that I was benefiting from, actually. I also saw another observation. I noticed that the adults on campus, my teachers, my counselors, thought differently about my ability to succeed. I had been in honors courses all throughout middle school and into high school, but at my new school, I spent a lot of time advocating for myself to make sure I stayed in more rigorous courses, even when I was doing well in them. There was always questions around, oh, are you sure that you can handle this class? Is this the right spot for you? So I noticed that happening as well. And I also noticed I was the only Black student in those classes. When I knew there were a few other Black students on campus, they weren't there with me. And all of this indicated to me that there were some significant complications with fairness for our schools in California, and that I wanted to dedicate my professional life to making sure that other students like me, that looked like me, didn't experience the same things. And I think this is especially relevant now, and as we just finished celebrating Juneteenth. If Juneteenth had been a national holiday when I was younger, I think that my experience may have been a little bit different. I might have felt a little bit more represented. But at the same time, we still see today challenges to things like ethnic studies and critical race theory, which would also provide that same acknowledgement of all students' identities. So this is an ongoing challenge, and I'm sure many of you share these types of experiences right now as students in our system. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Clara Medina, so that they can share their own personal experiences and how that informs their work. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and good afternoon to everyone. Hope this day is finding y'all well and really excited to speak with y'all. My name is Clara Medina. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm currently an External Relations Associate at the Education Trust West, where I work in collaboration with partners on a local and statewide level. I come to this work and show up fully every day with a lens informed by my experience navigating education as a low-income student and an undocumented Latinx student. It was very clear to me growing up that there was differences in the access folks had to opportunities that I didn't have as a poor student, and particularly as a poor Latina in like a really big family. So when it came to high school, my family knew that there were resources and opportunities that I just wouldn't be able to get at a local school. And so kind of by chance, it was actually a raffle system. I was able to attend a high school in a more affluent area of the San Fernando Valley where I'm from. For myself, it really came down to that chance and that that random opportunity that landed me in spaces where I was able to tap into professional development opportunities and a lot of resources that I otherwise would not have had access to. This is obviously not how things should be. It shouldn't have to come down to chance, and everyone should have equitable access to resources, regardless of where you're living, regardless of what your local school is, and regardless of your background. And so this really started informing my understanding of this very different lived experiences of students and what that means down the line as you're trying to access other opportunities in education and even higher education. For myself, even with the opportunity of going to this more affluent school, I faced a lot of limitations due to my citizenship status and had a very difficult time accessing higher education as an undocumented student. In the early 2010s, when I was a high school student, there was a very limited understanding about how to support undocumented students. And so a lot of the, trying to find how to apply to colleges, how to access financial aid was really done on my own and through the support of peers. And it's through experiences like that that I really gained this different lens and understanding and passion about advocacy around access and equity in education. And so I'm really excited to talk to you all more about this topic as we go through this presentation, but want to say how excited I am about it. I'll pass it over to Natalie.
Thank you, Clara. And we'd like to tell you a little bit about EdTrust West now. EdTrust West is a nonprofit education equity organization focused on education justice and closing achievement and opportunity gaps through research, data, policy analysis, and advocacy. Next slide. So the way that we do this work is through what we call our theory of change, which is the action steps that we take to get to the changes that we want to see. So first we start by listening. We look at what is happening in education. We talk to stakeholders at all levels. We talk to parents, students, advocates that are at the local level, teachers, just to get a sense of what is happening on the ground and what are some of the threats to equity and fairness that folks are experiencing. We also do this through, can we go back to the previous slide? Thank you. We also do this through research. We look at data. We look at, we use qualitative research like focus groups and interviews to get to the real ways that equity is being compromised in our school system. And we take that information and we engage educators, policymakers at all levels, whether that are school board members locally or elected officials at the state level. And we work with folks who make decisions and are champions of equity to secure the types of practice and policy changes we know will create more equity in the education system. So next slide. These are just a few examples of the type of research that we conduct at EdTrust West and some photos of the ways that we engage various stakeholders and work to make those changes. I will turn it back to Clara.
Awesome, thank you. So next slide. I would love to hear from y'all. Before we dive in, we've said equity a couple of times, and so I would specifically love to hear from y'all what equity means to you and what you think of when you think of racial equity. So I'll share my screen briefly, and if y'all could follow the instructions, there's two ways of submitting your response. You can either join by web, through this website and enter this code, or text Clara Medina 900 to 22333, and would love to hear from y'all what equity means to you, and if you're up for it too, what does racial equity look like to you, and what comes to mind? Awesome. I'm seeing fairness, equality, quality. Exactly. Providing everybody with resources that fit their desired needs, same opportunities, justice, equal treatment. Equity means acknowledging and addressing the different needs that different students require and accommodating accordingly rather than simply handing them the same things. Yes. Level playing field. Yes. Hearing a lot of equality, equal opportunity, equal resources. Some of the things we've uplifted so far. Awesome. Ensuring individual needs are fulfilled. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing and for sending in your responses. It's really powerful to see the ways in which you all are envisioning equity and the ways that you all are seeing it. And I often rely on my senses, right? Like, how does it feel? How does it taste? How does it look? And so I appreciate you all sharing a little bit. So I'll stop screen sharing and switch back. And yes, keep on sending it in. I'll see if there's a way where we can share this word cloud with y'all. Awesome. Thank you so much. And so for us, equity means recognizing the historical and systemic disparities in opportunities and outcomes, really echoing a lot of the things that you all shared. It means providing the resources necessary to addressing the disparities and dismantling barriers themselves. And at its core, it really means looking at the root of the disparities critically. And I hope that we can uplift this throughout the presentation today. So on to the next slide. I'm sure some of y'all have seen these images before, and if you haven't, I'll break it down for you. Though sometimes equality and equity are used interchangeably, there are some really critical differences between the two that are important to note and uplift. As you can see, for both, there's a barrier in front of the folks that are trying to view the game, and as well as an uneven ground to stand on. Both can be seen as metaphors for barriers and the structural oppression that folks face based on their identities and their backgrounds. However, under equality, we see that having the same size box to step on, although obviously equal, is not enough, given the different levels that folks are already beginning with and the different size of the fence that folks are already facing. However, in equity, there's an acknowledgement that there are different needs and each person has a different size box to step on. In education, for example, being equity-minded means giving a school that serves low-income communities or communities of color more resources and not equal resources because of the difference in the specific needs and gaps. So on to the next slide, I also want to ground us in this conversation around justice. Although we acknowledge the need to be equity-minded, at the end of the day, our goal is always to have justice in mind. And I really appreciate that that was one of the first words that came up in the word cloud, right? Really looking at the fence and the structural barriers themselves and seeking to dismantle those. So hope that grounds us as we're talking about all of these issues and advocacy. So on to the next slide. Would love to share a little bit about the history of advocacy and specifically to uplift the role of youth inside of it. Some of y'all might be familiar with the person on screen. Her name is Ella Baker. She helped students during the civil rights movement to organize peaceful protests and sit-ins through SNCC. And she really uplifted the leadership of students that she worked with. So in her words, in order to see where we're going, we not only must remember where we have been, but we must understand where we have been. And so I really want to uplift that students in particular have been engaging locally on a statewide level and nationally for generations. And it's important to really know that history around advocacy and organizing in critical issues like racial equity and education equity. So to uplift some of the examples, if we go on to the next slide, we can see a picture of the Chicano walkouts of 1968. It took place in Los Angeles, actually, and was led by high school students who were protesting the inequities that Latinx and Chicanx students faced in schools, and specifically in the LAUSD district, which is also the district that I come from. And this history of and tradition of walkouts is something that has continued up until this day. And we can see that actually in the next slide. In light of the 2018 Parkland shooting, there was a national movement of school walkouts that were led by high school students across the country, really calling attention to the gun violence faced by youth in spaces like schools in particular, but more broadly. And so really this tradition of like standing in your power and uplifting the issues that are faced locally is something that students have been doing at the forefront for a long time. And in critical moments such as, for example, in the next slide, with the Black Lives Matter movement, we're seeing also high school students and youth at the front and center of gathering and rallying and protesting. Specifically here, we can see the statewide protests that were planned in Minnesota by a collective called the Minnesota Teen Activists this past May, actually, in where we saw 118 schools actually participate to protest racial injustice and to honor the lives of Daunte Wright and George Floyd. And so for me, this is really personal, right? So when we go onto the next slide, I also wanted to uplift the ways in which advocacy and organizing has been really instrumental and formative for me. I was actually a student at UC Merced and graduated in 2019, go Bobcats. And being engaged in advocacy was actually really, really formative because for me, it allowed me to stand in my power as an undocumented student, as a trans student, and to really lift my voice. And so one thing that we protested in support of was for more resources for students of color and low-income students, specifically focused on the resources to retain students and to provide care. So we protested the groundbreaking of a development plan and called for a demilitarized campus and resources that focus on retention, such as cultural resource centers. And I was actually, and thankfully, because it's not always the case, able to see things come to fruition from the organizing that we did. And the very next semester opened up our first undergraduate cultural center. And I had the privilege of being the lead in its grand opening. So really just want to uplift like the power of advocacy and organizing and the ways in which it builds on the history that's been going on for a lot of generations in advocacy. So I'll pass it over to Natalie for the next slide.
Thank you, Clara. Similarly, this has really informed my orientation towards the power of students' voices. We worked in partnership with several student groups across the state in conjunction with a report that we released called Black Minds Matter that focused on the education needs of Black students in the various ways that they have been marginalized and the specific supports that Black students need to make sure that they're getting an equitable education in California. So after that report was released, we worked with Black and Brown student groups to uplift the need for a specific focus on the needs of Black students from pre-K to college. And this was a really empowering day, not only for us to be in partnership with students and moving these priorities forward, but also it was really inspiring to see the voices of students being heard at the state capitol in Sacramento and seeing students have a direct impact on the decisions that are made that affect them. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of advances we've seen in education equity and all of which have been impacted by student advocacy. First, we've seen equitable funding recently with the passing of the local control funding formula. And it sounds like Mary Perry from California PTA spoke to this a little bit earlier today, so I won't go into too much detail. Mary is definitely an expert and a great partner. But as she probably mentioned, before LCFF passed, all school districts receive the same amount of money per student, regardless of the relative needs of those different districts. But with LCFF, different schools receive different levels of funding based on whether they have low-income students, English learner students, or foster youth or homeless youth. So we've seen an increase in equity in how our schools are funded because schools that have more of those groups of students receive more funding. Next slide. We also have seen huge increase in equity because of the ban on willful defiant suspensions. So willful defiant suspensions are a classification of suspension that is sort of loosely defined as being insubordinate to teachers, being disruptive, but because there's a very fuzzy definition, there's a lot of room for bias when these suspensions are given to students. And we found that a disproportionate number of Black and Brown male students were getting suspended under this category. And we saw this as a significant impact on equity because this starts what is called, and folks are probably familiar with what's called the school to prison pipeline, where when students are suspended or expelled, it increases their chances of ending up in the state's carceral system. So there are huge implications for this and for students' ability to succeed. So with the ban on willful defiant suspensions, as you can see in this graph, there's a significant decrease in the suspensions from before this ban in 2011 to 12 to after in 2017 to 18. Next slide. We also see this for the through the local push for A through G for all. Folks are probably also familiar with the A through G sequence of courses, and these are the courses that high school students must take to just be eligible to apply for the California State University and University of California systems in California. And we've seen in our research that there are some high schools that don't even offer all of these courses, and then some schools where students have access to these courses, plus even more rigorous courses than these. And so this is a huge barrier to equity and the ability to access our public higher ed institutions. So there are groups like Future Leaders of America who are working locally to get A through G for all policies passed in their districts. And Future Leaders of America have been successful in doing this in districts like Oxnard Unified and Santa Maria Unified.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. And now to speak a little bit more about the ongoing equity challenges that advocates and youth are continuing to rally around and to really draw attention to. Yeah, so feel free to ask questions afterwards if there's any, but wanted to uplift some ongoing challenges. Next slide, please. So there's something really powerful about seeing the great improvements being made at the local level with the A through G for all campaigns that Natalie uplifted. And it also uplifts the broader equity issues around pathways to college. Like Natalie mentioned, completing these courses gives students access to higher education. As we can see in the graph, there are racial and socioeconomic disparities in A through G course completion. In particular, when we're looking at the numbers, we can see that Black, Native, Latinx, and Pacific Islander students have lower rates of completion. What this ends up meaning is that less than half of these students, along with less than half of low-income students, are not even eligible to apply for public colleges and universities. So as a state, we really need to grapple with these disparities as a structural issue. Next slide, please. We also know that enrollment of Black and Brown students in the UC is not representative. Enrollment of students of color, particularly Black and Latinx students, is low at our state's University of California system in comparison to the demographic changes in the state. For example, when looking at the graph on screen, we can see that Latinx students made up 33% of students in the 12th grade in 1999, and this has increased to 53% of students in 12th grade in 2019. However, we don't see the enrollment rates of Latinx students at the UC keeping pace with that demographic increase. And as a matter of fact, the enrollment that we see in 2019 is not even matching up to the demographic level at which it was in 1999. And so this is obviously an issue. It's not representative. And so in the next slide, we see that the admission rates at the UCs actually dropped significantly for Latinx and Black students after the ban on affirmative action in 1996. So it speaks to a broader equity issues and barriers in access for students across the board. We as an organization, along with a lot of partner organizations, actually engaged in the Prop 16 campaign this past year, which sought to reverse the ban on affirmative action. However, the election results showed that a majority of Californians didn't believe that race should be taken into account in admissions. But this is obviously an ongoing issue and something that orgs are continuing to work on because the impact is evident, right? Admission rates have gone down. We also recognize the critical role that access to financial aid and affordability plays in the rates of enrollment. So along with other organizations as well, we've been engaged in the All In for Financial Aid campaign to make sure that students have access to these resources. And finally, another critical issue that we wanted to uplift in the next slide is teacher diversity and retention in California. Despite being such a diverse state, there's a glaring lack of educators of color in California. In fact, 77% of students in California are students of color, but only 35% of educators are of color. It's no doubt that the issues that we've already talked about, the structural barriers like those in the A through G access, enrollment, financial aid, among other things, have had a negative impact on the process of becoming an educator of color. And organizations such as ETW are working towards investments in programs that help support more diversity in teacher workforce, including residency programs, grant programs, and programs that help school support staff that's already on the campus, like teachers' aides, becomes teachers down the line. So we're hopeful that this money will be allocated in these programs in the governor's budget, and really just wanted to flag that these are ongoing issues, but that there's a wide breadth of advocacy to make sure that we are addressing these gaps, and that it's obviously an ongoing issue, but something that youth have been particularly involved with as well.
So a lot of folks have already spoken to the various ways that students can get involved in making changes both locally and at the state level. So I will offer some of those opportunities as well. Next slide, please. So getting involved locally, it's amazing the type of impact that students can have on their own experiences at the local level. A lot of crucial decisions happen at the school and district levels. So I encourage folks to seek out opportunities like Brooks mentioned, sitting on school site councils. School site councils decide how a school's money gets spent, and you get to prioritize what your school is going to focus on. Also, district advisory committees. Mary probably mentioned, and Brooks did too, that the local control and accountability plan process requires consulting various stakeholders, including students. So sitting on one of these committees can be very influential on how your district prioritizes its spending. Also, we've talked about school boards and being a student representative on a school board. And also, maintaining relationships with state representatives. They're elected to serve you, not just your parents, not just voting members of your community, but also students, and they make crucial decisions when it comes to education. So raising your concerns to them is also vitally important. Next slide. Also focusing on processes meaning the ways that schools and districts make decisions. So there's a process called this, or the plan called the school plan for student achievement, and schools have to develop these plans every year, and it informs how the school serves the needs of all students, particularly the most vulnerable student groups. So I highly recommend finding out about this process at your school. There's a similar process with the local control and accountability plans at the district level. Students should be a part of that process. So, and districts vary on their ability to make sure that students are incorporated in making those decisions. So it might be, unfortunately, on you to reach out to your district and say, hey, our voices should be heard in this process. And again, school board meetings. There's, like Brooks mentioned, there's always public comment and testimony that happens at school board meetings. So if there's an issue on an agenda that is really important to you, that is a forum for you to have your voice be heard. Next slide, please.
And then to close, we just wanted to uplift a couple of local initiatives and organizations that are doing really great work that you can get involved in. And really also just to emphasize the power in joining student advocacy and student advocacy organizations in your community. There's probably like some campaigns happening in your local community that you can get involved in, and to uplift a couple of the partners that are doing powerful work. And I know one of them was uplifted earlier. In Los Angeles, for example, getting involved with Community Coalition or Inner City Struggle. In the Central Coast, getting involved with Future Leaders of America. And in the Central Valley, getting involved with Californians for Justice, just to name a couple of really powerful organizations that are doing things on the ground level with students. Awesome. So on to the next slide. We'll open it up for Q&A, but thank you all for listening and looking forward to the questions.
Oh my gosh, Natalie and Clara, that was that was so insightful. Thank you guys so much for preparing that presentation and for taking the time out of your days to speak with us. We actually have some questions in the chat. So the first question comes from Emily, who asks, what is your opinion on the importance of media coverage on youth advocacy and activism?
I can take a stab at this question. I think that it's significant. I think that one thing that I think is a challenge, and it's something that we grapple with too, is making sure that student voices are uplifted in the media. It can be really influential to highlight issues that are surfacing for youth that local and state leaders should be addressing. So I think it's very important. That said, that doesn't mean that you can't have an impact if you're not getting media coverage. It's still vitally important for you to raise your voice and perspective directly to decision makers when you can. And I've seen that make an impact, even at school board or state board of ed meetings, I should say. And I'm sure Zed has seen this too, that when we see students testifying to issues they're experiencing, the board reacts. It definitely shapes their views and their decisions.
I wholeheartedly agree, and that's definitely something that I've seen. Really quickly, before we move on to the next question, if you guys could please just put up that last slide so that students could get the opportunity to jot down your guys' contact info, that'd be really awesome.
I also want to say, as a Gen Z millennial cusp, but more so a millennial, I think it's really powerful to see the ways that youth are taking media into their own hands through unconventional ways like Instagram or TikTok. I think I've really been seeing, and having organized in the conservative rural context when I was a student, you had to do like whatever was at your hands. And sometimes those more unconventional media routes really like got folks' attention. And so I think being creative too, when there's not like traditional media that's paying attention to an issue, I've been seeing really as really successful, especially during this pandemic.
Awesome. Another question in the chat is from Mia, who asks, how did the two of you get involved in EdTrust West, and what advice would you give to student leaders interested in starting or joining a nonprofit?
I'll start this one out too. I actually was a practicing attorney before I began working at EdTrust West. And in my work as an attorney and someone who is passionate about education justice in particular, I saw that there was more ways to be nuanced about how decisions around education were being made through policy rather than through law. So I looked for opportunities to gain experience in education policy, and that led me to EdTrust West, and I've been there now for about 7.5 years. So that's sort of how I got there. And then in relationship to forging a path in doing work in education policy, I think what you're doing right now, being a part of this day, learning what you're learning now, puts you already ahead of the curve to chart a path towards this as a career, and just continuing to be a leader on your school's campus, at the state level, at the local level, is setting you up to be successful and to learn what you need to learn to get to where you want to be in your career in ed policy.
Our next question is from Caitlin, who asks, what is your strongest argument to people who argue that more blanket actions like affirmative action are ultimately unfair?
I guess I'll start us off. I think one thing that I think organizations like the EdTrust West and other really great organizations that were involved, for example, in the Prop 16 campaign, things they did were really to just point to the data. It's almost undeniable the impact that the ban on affirmative action has had on the retention and enrollment of students of color. And so I think like often partnering with organizations that have that capacity to build out that data as students, I think can be like a really powerful tool in your hands. But would love to hear from Natalie, who was here during the campaign this past year.
Yeah, I think one thing I would do too is to just demystify some of the myths around how affirmative action works in California, particularly around college admissions. A lot of people think that there are quotas associated with affirmative action, that you're taking a certain number of this group and that group, but it actually doesn't function in that way. If affirmative action were to be legal, it would be one of about 14 different decision-making mechanisms or components of evaluating a student's application. So it's one thing among 14 that would be taken into account. And because we see, like Clara mentioned, such significant disparities, it is part of maintaining these structures of marginalization to just completely ignore the role race plays in people's opportunities.
Awesome. Carla asks, as students, how can we fight for an improvement for the ELL system?
That is a great question. I love that question. There are actually school level and district level committees called English Learner Advisory Committees or District English Learner Advisory Committees that folks' parents can sit on and that students can work with and inform to help make decisions around how English learners are provided services. And I appreciate the question, especially because this is a group of students that are often not included in conversations around how to allocate resources, how to make decisions that focus on students. So that's definitely an opportunity to do that work. But I do acknowledge that it's an uphill battle because this is a group of students that have been ignored in those processes historically.
Bea asks, and this is probably going to be our last question, unfortunately, what resources do you recommend to learn about systematic disparities and how they affect us?
Oh my gosh, there's so many that come to mind. But before I jump in, Clara, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, same here, Natalie. I think for me, it depends on, I'm such a hands-on person. I think my greatest lessons have come from being involved in the organizations that are addressing things locally. So I think that's a really great resource to lean on is these organizers, the campaigns that are looking at your local context. I think it can be really affirming for someone to say, like, this is what's happening here in like this valley or this city, and would really lean on those. So that's where I would start, to be honest.
I agree. I think that looking to community-based organizations for where you are who speak to the specific needs in your communities are a great place to start. Taking a look at our reports and the reports of our partners, we have a lot of folks who work directly with students who are partners. We've mentioned a few times Californians for Justice. They've released a number of reports and have a lot of resources around both the things that the systemic disparities students experience and ways that students can get involved. Our reports identify and lift up what those disparities look like and practices that educators, school leaders, district leaders have implemented to address those disparities. So I encourage you to just check out websites for some of the groups we mentioned in our website to find out more. And also reach out to us if you have specific questions.
Awesome. Yeah, guys, everyone make sure to take down their contact information. But Natalie and Clara, it's been an amazing opportunity to be able to speak with you guys today and to hear from you and learn from you. So thank you all so much. And we wish you the best for the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're so excited to be here. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.